this very unsuspecting day, we received probably one of the most vivid examples of how to end a game in our decade. A game developed by the Italian studio LKA, which masterfully combines trauma, pain, distorted reality, and a simple yet effective gameplay into a neat RPG package. And of course, I'm talking about Martha's Dead, a short and bitter horror game, taking only about 6.5 hours to finish, but leaving you with a lot more to ponder about. In order to understand exactly why and how this game manages to pleasantly surprise us all, we must dig a little deeper. So this video is then divided into 4 sections, and our first stop is one element that makes or breaks every RPG game. Believe it or not, the story of Martha's Dead is actually quite simple, and paradoxically, it kind of isn't, which is exactly why it's so clever. It happens during World War II in Italy. You play as a girl named Julia in a family with a father and mother and maybe a sister named Martha, who, yep, you guessed it, is dead. Now, why did I say maybe? Well, because as you progress through the traumatic and quite disturbing story, everything that you thought was real and happening becomes a big fat giant question mark. Is it all happening in the protagonist's head, or is it real? The only thing you can distinguish for certain at every turn is pain. Now, if the story of Martha's Dead was quote-unquote usual, you'd have a basic plot constructed in your head with basic elements or emotions that the game was trying to aim for. You'd have no trouble recalling that, for instance, oh, because X happened, it made Y feel and act this way, so that's why Z was the element or the theme, so to speak. A simple example of that would be in Fallout New Vegas when the protagonist is shot and left behind to die. That's why they seek the man who killed them to potentially have revenge, which player is presented options with. But in this game, the only thing you have is the element. Almost all the events are in question. This style of powerful storytelling is called unreliable narration. The narrator of the story, Julia, has severe mental health issues, so anything that's shown to you in her perspective, aka the entire game, cannot be trusted. But this sort of thing actually isn't new. The difference is that in Martha's Dead, it's done very well. You receive valuable, almost objective information at the right time, just enough to make you feel like you understand everything, but keeps the rest of it obscure and vague, just enough to add thrill and suspense and to make you think that it has a larger point. It's a very delicate balance. If you thought everything was real, you simply just wouldn't care. And on the other hand, if everything was clear and cut and dry, you'd lose interest because the game is low on action. This scale in Martha's Dead is balanced supremely well. The atmosphere in the game is also set to perfection, from the classic walking alone in the forest while the chilling feeling of something terrible is about to happen, all the way through the depiction of war and losing loved ones. Both inside and outside struggle are shown to make you think a little bit deeper about everything. A concept perfectly captured by this quote: "Evil makes us evil." To accommodate all of this, it has beautiful soundtracks and good sound design. Everything that you see in the game has some meaning to it. Not probably from a practical point of view of interaction or just action, but something a little bit more subtle, which brings us to the next section. Throughout the game, you'll encounter countless symbolic elements placed very carefully to give you a better sense of what the story is really about. Heavy usage and emphasis on cameras points to the idea of self-reflection, point of view, and memories, good or bad, all of which are the main driving elements of the story. As the story unfolds, Julia starts to question things, especially herself, more and more, showing her descent into madness. The puppet show theater, when Julia tries to recollect her broken memories, is dealing with trauma and how we sometimes just choose to simply forget certain things instead of processing pain. Honestly, this part alone deserves a separate video because it's so fucking brilliant, especially the part where Julia murders and buries her mother's body. And instead of showing everything that violent, it's played in a theater, again perfectly capturing the deteriorating mind of Julia trying to mask reality. There's also recurring dreams that shows Julia's pain and suffering again and again. They're quite obscure and disturbing, just like they can be in real life, and it really humanizes the character, making you actually feel for her to some extent, or at least experience just a little bit of what having mental issues or depression is like. As you're trying to unmask the story, she is trying her best to mask it. But probably the most important masking that the game does is the game offers a decent variety of things a player can do, from roaming around the map and taking pictures and manually processing them to cool gimmicks like tarot cards. The world itself is small, but the thing is that it doesn't really need to be big because the real content is actually with or within the protagonist Julia. The game would still work even if it all happened in one room, and that's the brilliance of it. The developers, one can argue, knew exactly what they were doing because, remember, it's still an indie game, meaning that the budget and resources are limited. So making sure that the usage of things like animation is kept to a minimum is a must, because it reveals lacking areas. Keeping the game mechanics simple yet effective and all the other areas that show where your game is lacking is also a must. And they did a wonderful job. The cutscenes mostly use cinematic camera movements to tell you the story. You almost never encounter actual NPCs that you can talk to, which in turn reduces chance of bugs occurring, which can ruin the immersion and atmosphere. See, every little choice that the developers made was both deliberate and forced at the same time. Just like in movies with lower budgets, you often see limited areas and use of environment, instead of big, epic, expensive flash that only some studios can afford. But the best part about all this is that it just works. Julia doesn't really need to interact with anyone, which creates a feeling of solitude, which then reinforces the main theme of the game. The environment is picked to be simple and yet somewhat graphically impressive, because in this game you really don't care about ray-traced particles across the floor. Now, I do have to admit that the game mechanics can get a little janky and awkward at times, especially with some movements, but it's honestly not that noticeable, and it does a perfect job of not just masking everything it lacks, but using it to its advantage. As mentioned before, the game has the proper atmosphere, hence setting the tension element of the horror. The game's pretty light on jump scares because it really doesn't need it, and that's because the horror isn't supernatural. It comes from humans, or rather just one. This really is a genius approach because it shows how people have an entire universe on their minds. This reality can be dark, all imagined, and yet just as real. Real enough to make you believe things that aren't true, and real enough to make you do horrible things. And of course, we have brilliant examples of how this is done in movies like The Shining, but it doesn't make the game cliche or repetitive. It still feels original and fresh because it's never done before in this exact same way. And in some strange way, I also think Martha's Dead is a plotless story. Not that it literally doesn't have a plot, but it doesn't matter. None of the events and interactions, it just wants to leave you with its main element, horror, or, well, mental health. I also really appreciate the final message of the game about seeking help and mental health in general. It's a very noble thing to say. All in all, I think the game is a solid 8 in my book, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's a horror fan and adores clever storytelling. Make sure to let me know what you think down in the comments, and see you in the next one, motherfuckers.